Hi, Mage fans. This is Terry Robinson with Mage the Podcast, and my guest this evening is noted Mage the Ascension author and superfan, James Sambrano. James has written for a number of Mage the Ascension books and is bringing his expertise about North America's indigenous peoples and cultures, as well as Mage, to Mage the Podcast. James, how you doing?
I'm doing amazing. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. Today I got the revised convention books in the mail.
Oh.
I finally cashed in my drive-thru RPG pennies that I got from Ascension's Landscape.
Sounds exciting.
Yeah! And I checked on my boys first. That is the Syndicate.
And my boys too, by the way.
And people were like, I don't think you could have a heroic syndicate member. And I'm like, I take that personally as a heroic syndicate member. I'm going to go cry. But I find it interesting that I think the syndicate and I think it may be the New World Order or the Void Engineers, they actually are listed as having the same like White Wolf number. Like they're both White Wolf 2047. Yeah. And I'm like, if the syndicate was really in charge, they would have never let this happen.
I remember when all the Mage 20th stuff started coming out and we were all like, okay, this time the number is going to be right. It's going to be in the right order. And then I think something happened with like the cookbook or something. And everything's messed up now.
Yeah. Book of the Fallen is now the 6th book in the 5 books so far published for Mage 20th, which I think is strangely appropriate. As more and more time goes on, I kind of fall in love with revised. I just like the writing style is a little bit different and it's very... use this, put it in your game, here's a bunch of story hooks, and we're gonna assume that you figured out the philosophy already. It is nice to see a different version of the game, which has me excited about M5, because it's either more of the same, which is great, because I like what we have now, or it's something completely different, and assuming it doesn't like suck in a way that poisons the well, I think we all win.
There was a lot of stuff that we really wanted to do with 20th that we just weren't allowed to. For example, just as a small example, like the tradition name changes, they were like, absolutely not, you can't do this because it's like the big trademarked tradition name that's going to sell. So you can't call the Dreamspeakers the Kavadi.
Oh, interesting. So that's why they're like, some call them the Society.
Yes, we couldn't actually change the actual name because they were like, no, that's the trademark. That's why, like, I feel like everyone probably agrees, like maybe not on Dreamspeakers, but on Akashic Brotherhood, I feel like everyone's like, yeah, Akashian is way better. I feel like there's no one who doesn't think that that's true, but they couldn't change the name because he was like, nope, that's our trademark, that's our moneymaker, you can't do it.
Yeah, the only one I can never quite remember is the alternate term for the Cult of Ecstasy.
Sahaja.
Yes. That.
Oh, some of those have been like that, and Chakravanti have been around since Sorcerer's Crusade and stuff like that. I actually prefer Chakravanti over Euthanatos because I feel that when you look into the history of that tradition, it's really a lot more in the Indian history, and like the Greek stuff kind of comes a little bit later. So the fact that today it's like the Euthanatos emphasizes the Greek, it doesn't make as much sense to me. I feel like it should emphasize the Indian stuff, which is Chakravanti.
I feel as if one of the downfalls of Mage is in our lack of having a meta plot, we actually don't have enough like named characters to carry on what we think the standard for a tradition would be. So like the only person we have that is a magus of the Indian subcontinent is Vormos, Grand Harvester of Souls.
Yeah. Well, so my opinion is that the people who are doing Mage were probably back then, for being a bunch of mostly white men, were doing the best job of a lot of the other World Darkness supplements. Like I compare, like I was just reading Dreamspeakers so we can talk about it, and I'm thinking about that compared to reading the tribe books for the 2 pure tribes. I'm like, oh man, this is actually so much better, even though there's still problems.
What is a pure tribe?
A pure tribe is one of 3, though one is extinct, tribes of werewolves from Werewolf the Apocalypse, including the Uktena, the Croatan, who is the one that's gone. And I'm going to say the name of the 3rd tribe, but you shouldn't. But I'm going to say it once so we know who we're talking about. It's the Wendigo.
It rhymes with wet dingo, and we'll go from there. Yeah.
But it is not a good idea to speak it, even if like the only thing you care about is being respectful of culture. There's more reasons not to say it. I only said it so that we have context, and we're going to leave it at that.
And I super appreciate you providing that, if you were closer, you could hear me audibly sweating for fear of me just coming up with a string of words where my computer bursts into flame and somehow I've committed a hate crime. So that's why I like being able to talk to experts.
That word is different than what I think most people worry about saying. Like, it's not a slur. It's not like something like our skin, like you can't call an indigenous person our skin. However, it is tied to specific stories that are considered to be very real, and there are associations with those stories that give them more or less power in negative or positive ways. And essentially that is a story you want to not be contributing more power to. So that's why you shouldn't be saying it.
But the idea is that this word in some way has power through invoking a story that we would rather not invoke. So if we can avoid saying it, we should. Is that a safe way to say it?
Yeah, that's the short version, yes.
So that also explains, going back one, why future fates had to be included, that you weren't allowed to make any canon changes to the meta plot of the game.
Yeah.
to bring it back around to that. So
Yeah.
What have you worked on in Mage of the Ascension?
So I was a big collaborator actually I didn't technically do any of the writing on Mage 20th, but my influence is pretty big, especially in like I did some editing, but like also like a lot of the Dreamspeakers section was associated with stuff that like Sater and I talked about for like months and months and months. We talked about Hollow One stuff too, and a lot of the Disparate Alliance stuff that's in there. But also like I think I might have been one of the very first people to get like his original finished first draft of it, and I had it in physical form because we live like an hour and a half from each other.
Okay. So
we were hanging out and he's like, take this and read it and give me some notes. But yeah, I have a story in the Truth Beyond Paradox book. I've worked on Gods and Monsters, and I have collaborated on every other book that's come out.
And if you'd like to hear more about that, James was on our roundtable discussion of Gods and Monsters, link in the show notes. Also, James did a wonderful interview with co-host Josh Heath on Josh's Werewolf the Podcast on Indigenous stories in Werewolf. How did you get into role-playing games?
When I was in high school, maybe middle school, I think it was high school, my little brother, I don't know where he got a hold of this book, but he got a hold of the MERP book, Middle-earth Role-Playing, before it was owned by ICE, and like now it's something else, but like, and he was like, hey, I found this game. We both like Lord of the Rings, and we were nerds. And he was like, run this game for me. And I ran a game for him and his friend, just two people, for a while. And then he ended up picking up Vampire. And I ran a game just for him where he played a Nosferatu chucklefuck that got ruined by the cam. And I was like, wow, I was like really into Vampire. I was like really impressed with how it was written and how it was not just kind of like 70s fantasy nerdery stuff, which is fine, but like I was a gothy little teenager, so I was like, ooh, look at this edgy stuff. And I was like, let me explore the rest of their books. And I went to the store one day and kind of went through the rest, and I came across a Mage, and I was like, oh, this shit's blowing my mind. And so Mage was actually, I think, the third role-playing game I ever got involved with, and it's my main one till this day.
So we're talking about the Dreamspeakers and representation of Indigenous Magick in Mage. What is your background with those topics?
So other than the fact that I am an Indigenous person and my heritage is both Chiricahua, Apache, and Quota Indian, for the non-American audiences, one of those is in the U.S. and the other is in Mexico. Although those borders landed on us, so it's arguable about that because Apache are actually kind of both. But anyway, the other qualification I have is that I'm also a historian who specializes in Indigenous histories, as well as the history of colonization, and also specific theories that are focused around indigenization, like decolonization, for example, or survivance and other things that we talk about in the academic world of what indigeneity means.
The Dreamspeakers, even within the second edition context, are listed as a case where the Council of the Nine Mystic Traditions didn't know what to do with the group. They saw all these people that weren't white, and they're like, your practices look vaguely similar. We're going to lump you together because we need a ninth group. Does it make sense to talk about shared beliefs and practices among such a hugely varied group of people?
The answer is yes and no. And it's also long and complex. But let me see if I can shorten this. So yes, it is true that it is a vast group of people. And we're talking like the primary continents they're pulling from in this are Australia, both the Americas, Africa, and also like all of the Pacific Islands and stuff like that, which is technically a continent, but it is a group of people for where these practices are coming from. So it is true that those are wildly different practices, wildly different beliefs, wildly different like ideas of what like gods are and what the right way to interact with gods or spirits, however you want to consider it, because I'm probably going to slip a little bit away from game terminology here, and that needs to be respected, because when you lump everyone into one group, then you have someone who is like, I'm a Cherokee and I'm wearing a headdress and I have a right to do that, even though Cherokees didn't wear the headdresses that we're discussing about when we're talking about who has the right to wear headdresses, who doesn't. You know, you have like term like things like one thing that comes up in this book and the Chronicles of Darkness version of Mage is the term mana, and mana is very specifically a term that belongs to one culture, and so trying to use it for everyone is a little bit misleading at the nicest way I could say that, but it's also just kind of like the book describes, and I actually think the authors did this on purpose, But like the book describes them being like, we don't get it. It's all really confusing. So you're all just one people. And you don't want to do that, because also when the book describes with the history, as most of us who get really deep dive into Mage history know, like the Council of Nine doing that was a big mistake, and it was really offensive, and they shouldn't have done it, because it made it so that the Dreamspeakers have always been like, yes, we're allies, but sometimes we're kind of fuck you guys, because they're not treated right.
And to talk about that history, so in addition to that, like Dreamspeaker Second Edition also brings in like the Sama as well, and the Tungu, like indigenous peoples of the Russian high steppes, where it even goes beyond the first edition brown people to literally anyone whose culture has kind of been trampled by seemingly somebody else, which in this weird way kind of does give a common experience, but like that's the shittiest reason to put a group of people together. Hey, we've all been boned.
I hear what you're saying there, but also I will say that it is in my own life, my lived experience as an Indigenous person, the kind of like connection and like almost brotherhood you can make you can experience with people who aren't from your tribal background but still have the Indigenous experience is really powerful, and it matters a lot to me.
So that is a case where they will have something of a shared experience, but that doesn't necessarily mean they will have a shared magic or paradigm then.
Again, yes and no. I feel like when we look at all of the traditions, we can see big amalgamations of different magical practices that they eventually kind of turn into one. But even if let's just go towards the big one. Let's talk about the Order of Hermes. The Order of Hermes has all these different houses, right? Even though they kind of have the Order of Hermes in itself has their own kind of like standard paradigm and practice. Each house has a unique take on it, a unique spin on it. And then there's also the non-extant houses that have been lost over time or have become part of other traditions, or depending on what their story is, that had their own kind of unique paradigms. And to the point where, I don't remember the name of it, but you might know, but there's one specific Hermetic house that is no longer extant, but ended up joining the Verbena because it ended up that their paradigm was much more closely associated with theirs and with the Order of Hermes. A lot of them are like that, right? It's worse with the Dreamspeakers. It's worse because the ones that are like that are like, even with the Order of Hermes, we're like, yeah, they're primarily European, right? They probably come from the same part of the world. But again, with the Dreamspeakers, we're drawing from at minimum 4 continents, I think is what I ended up counting. And if we don't count the islands, we should count the islands. And that's just a lot. It's basically, quote unquote, the rest of the world, which is kind of messed up because like many role-playing games, there are stuff coming out lately that's changing. But a lot of fantasy tropey stuff tends to be based in European-focused fantasy. It's a Western point of view. And so you're taking that into this game where, like, if you look at the majority of the traditions of where they came from, most of them came from Europe. And so the fact that Europe is this one tiny part of the world, but they are so heavily represented, has to do with the actual history of, imperialism and colonization. And it gets reflected in our game. Like I said, the book kind of touches on that and gives a nod to the fact that they made that mistake. But the other thing that I want to get to, and I keep trying to get to and messing up, is there are things to be had in common about belief systems amongst Indigenous people. Indigenous people are not in any way whatsoever a big, like, massive block, but there are well-studied by Indigenous folks commonalities in Indigenous methodologies and belief systems. And kind of a really simple, short-handed one is that Indigenous folk tend to be a communal society as opposed to a independence-focused society, whereas Western thinking and European thinking tends to be more independence-focused. And that is something that you can draw as a theme that belongs to this group that is drawn from all of them, the idea that they're a communal society. It's a part of the reason I have a really big problem with the solitaries, because I don't think they're thematically representative of who Dreamspeakers are at all.
And it was House Bjornair, which split from the order and joined the Verbena. Can I summarize communitarian versus individualist as what can we do versus what can I do?
That's close, but I think I would feel better if we said, in the independence focus, it's more like you can achieve based off of the empowerment of self. And the communal focus, it's you can achieve based on the empowerment of community.
Is that independent of group size? In pre-contact North America, like, the more we dig into the archaeological record, the higher and higher the estimates for the number of people that were in the Americas before the Columbian Exchange began just keeps going up and up. So we kind of have this association where it's like, oh, you got a tribe and there's only 100 people, but now we're discovering there are confederacies of possibly millions. Is that communitarian attitude independent of scale? When I think of some of the great cultures or some of the large cultures of Mesoamerica, were those still communitarian as well?
They were. So you're going to have scholars who disagree. First thing I want to say, you're going to have scholars who disagree. My own scholarship is focused on studying history from the Indigenous perspective. So I have some things that I talk about and believe and feel like I have evidence to back up, that there are historians who have focused on the European perspective who are like, no, you're not correct. So I want to be clear about that. As in many practices, but especially with historians, everyone disagrees. I feel there's evidence for, I'm not the only scholar who feels there's evidence for, that it is not at all based off of group size, because yeah, you're right, like you're talking about the Mesoamericans still were community focused, and so was like the Mississippians, who were like the biggest society in North America. You can even look at a group that was existing at the in the early days of colonization, and still extant, but like was playing an important role, the Iroquois Confederacy, and they were a massive organization of several tribes who still were, a communal society. But you can also look back in African sites for that as well. But what ends up making the difference between communally focused societies and independence focused societies is not size-based whatsoever. It's based off of the history of what inspired imperialism. And that being that there were groups primarily in Europe, and definitely the biggest empire that matters for colonization was England. But there were lots of things going on where they were dealing with their poor land, essentially, their inability to feed their numbers by, instead of finding ways to build up the society that they had, because they were also dealing with like their feudal systems and stuff like that. That was kind of like a hierarchy that was built on like pushing some people down. And those ideas spread eventually into imperialism in order to acquire the land they needed to sustain themselves. But that imperialism was also colonization, and that's what introduced. So that's where the independence-focused sides began, because when you engage in imperialization and colonization, you were essentially leaving your homelands behind, your connections, your family. Sometimes, you can argue, oh, this one person took their family, but like by and large, it's a disconnecting practice. And because it's disconnecting, it forced people to think independently, because that was how we're going to survive. Whereas by and large, indigenous folks throughout history didn't engage in imperialism and colonization. There's some small stuff, but not on that scale.
Just to make sure I have the lay of the land, I'm thinking it's somewhere between 15 and 40,000 years ago, the Bering Land Bridge is open, and that migration we look for, it was not a bunch of males pursuing prey. It seemed to be large people migrations. It seemed to be entire groups and communities making that move. And it's kind of fascinating to look at Beringia during the Ice Age. It was as landlocked as Idaho is. So I remember in my head thinking about oceanic crossing and this thing being like 10 foot wide and everyone pursuing like a woolly mammoth, but in actuality it was several hundred miles wide. So we have this movement of peoples, and based on the archaeological evidence from like the St. Lawrence area, it was a large group migration. It was not an individual group. Now, in contrast, when Europeans came over, you had the Spanish that seemed to primarily be seeking tribute and resources, as opposed to the English, which were actually looking to relocate people. But when they did, they, in general, were moving small groups of men to set up a new society of some sort to produce, hopefully, food crops or other raw materials to send back to a mercantilist main country. Is that a rough layout of things?
You're definitely expanding on the whole idea, but you're expanding on some important aspects of what we're going on, especially when you're intoning mercantilism, which I was originally trying to ignore. But it's important. Actually, mercantilism is hugely important to understanding the whole idea of independence-focused thinking.
My big thing was to contrast the fact that in terms of raw human destruction, one could argue that the Spanish may have been bigger in terms of raw warfare and plague spreading, in terms of just flat-out killing people. But when it comes to destruction of cultures, that seems to be an English thing, as they're slowly pushing people off of their land, as opposed to just demanding their stuff.
Yeah, I think they both engaged in both either way, but also, yes, I agree that you could say one is more responsible than the other at that time period. And, people don't talk about it as much, too. It's interesting. But, first contact wasn't even necessarily Columbus, right? It was the people going a Viking. And they, people are like, well, why didn't they spread plague? Because they're also European. Well, it's because Vikings took baths and other Europeans didn't do that.
You've made the indication that in general, indigenous peoples tend to be more communitarian. Are there any other commonalities? Like, one that often gets shoved in there is the idea of some sort of shamanic belief, which we can give a description for.
We can talk about that. There's one other thing, at least, I would like to bring up. There's lots of stuff, but there's at least one other thing I'd like to mention. I feel that applying shamanism, at least as a whole, to like North American indigenous religious beliefs is not the best way to handle it. Some people are going to argue with me about this, and there's valid arguments. I already start with the problem with the fact that we're starting with a term that originates somewhere else and is describing a different people.
I think it's a Tungu word. It's translated into Russian, and it literally comes out to something like one who knows.
Also, though, because of the effects of the way that word has spread to indigeneity. If you went to the Yucatan today and like interviewed a practicing Maya shaman, they might tell you, oh, that is our word. It's spelled Xaman. So that's how it's Maya. But I think that the reason stuff like that happens, and it makes it hard sometimes to trace things. Like we know the root of this word, but like other things happen that way because of the impacts of colonization. People adopt being called these names that don't belong to them because it's the known way to describe yourself to a paradigm, let's say, that is primarily Western in its approach. It's kind of weird. So you'll find people calling themselves that and saying it was their word. But also, I think it's probably more fair to, if we're going to paint this broad brush, which again, we are acknowledging has problems, but if we're going to paint this broad brush, to say that what we're looking at more is animism and that it isn't universal, because I feel like that definitely includes a lot of practices and beliefs that shamanism doesn't, and also precludes some stuff that is kind of implicit in shamanism that isn't necessarily as common with indigenous practitioners.
When I think shamanic, to me the core of it is the idea that you have some special person or group of people that have a tool set that they are somehow changing their consciousness that allows them to interface with something else. That can either be something as simple as trying to gain vision to the future, or talking to a spirit world, or ancestors, or transcendental energies of the world. But it seems like in lay parlance, shaman kind of is a role of almost a psychopomp, a go-between. They have access to either this other wisdom or this other place, and it is their role in their group to harness that for the benefit or for the safety of the group. Is that a safe starting point, that when we say shamanic or shaman, to use that?
No, I think that's pretty good. The only thing I would add is that when we're talking outside of like mage on a more specific focus, is that usually people studying, like anthropologists, are going to say that specific tool set you're describing is by and large drugs, hallucinogenic stuff. And so because of that, because anthropologists kind of tend to lean into that as the primary definition, that's why I don't like to lean into it as what we're talking about when we're talking about Dreamspeaker paradigm. You can also apply shamanism to the cult, right? To the Sahajya, because they're also using a specific tool set to alter their perception of the world to gain access to another. But we wouldn't call them that in Mage. We would, like, by and large, we're not calling them shamans. And so that's why I'm not sure if that's the best term to use, even though, yes, the books have been using them.
But it gives us something like a working definition that we can depart from. Sometimes I feel like I'm reading something from like the DSM where it's blah blah is going to have 5 of the following 7 characteristics. Like I think in M20 we get the Ngoma, which are specifically listed, I think, as being non-animistic and non-shamanic. They're almost like sub-Saharan African hermetics, or more accurately, the Order of Hermes is a northern equivalent of this practice that has been around for thousands of years. So
yes.
So you've talked about animism. And when I think animism, I think the idea that all objects, places, and creatures have some sort of spiritual essence. But even more specifically, that is something that is, I don't necessarily want to say conscious, but capable of motivated action. That, like, in the paradigm of Mage, sure, everything has a spiritual essence. It exists in the penumbra, and it's powered by quintessence. But animism suggests that there is something more to it. What's a working definition we can use for animism?
Probably what I would say, and I'm leaning into a little bit the fact that we're talking about Mage, like I might, is that animism is the idea that people aren't the only people. There's dog people, there's rock people, there's sky people. Everyone is a people of some kind and has their own care and concern. But also the important thing to take away from that is, if we are behaving as we should be behaving, we're respecting the dog people as much as the human people, and we're interacting with them as they are people worthy of interacting with, just as like another country. You know, if we want the dog people to work with us, we need to negotiate with them and offer something that's of value to them in order to have them work with us, and also respect the fact that their ways aren't our ways.
So it sounds like there are kind of 3 elements to that. One, there are entities that are not humans that have personhood.
Yes.
That we recognize as agents with their own agenda. 2, that agenda should be respected.
Yes.
That we don't get to tell the dog people what is important to dog people.
Yeah.
And the third part is what I'll say egalitarianism, or cosmopolitanism. They are not necessarily more or less important than us.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that's very important. In fact, arguably, depending on who you talk to, some of them can be more important than us. You know, it's been said, like, when you think about it, if we, the human people, were to disappear, the tree people are going to be still here. Like, right, the grass people will still be here. The flower people will still be here. Us leaving isn't going to hurt them. So they, in some ways, are more important people.
So we have animism and we have a shamanic idea. You said that there are other things that aren't necessarily universal, but that generally we can say is common to maybe indigenous magical practices.
Well, there's a million, but the one thing, like the Dreamspeaker stuff, almost doesn't touch on it at all, and I feel like it's centrally important, is the idea of connection to family, how Dreamspeakers tend to be very, again, communally focused. They're living with their family, they're living in their community, and their focus is on empowering their community and helping their community, right? Most Dreamspeakers never leave the place that they live. And so here's how I want to expand on that, and I think it's really important, is that there is a very common theme amongst many indigenous practices that you have some people misinterpret this and they'll be like, oh, Native Americans are so natural or whatever. But what it is that there is an idea of connection to space. Like, you are not who you are. You do not have your definition of self and your identity, or in your community doesn't, without also the connection to space, which is why, in my opinion, at least in my educated opinion, that you don't have as much imperialistic attitudes. Again, you can argue that there are, but by and large, in indigenous history, there's not as much imperialistic attitudes that were in Europe. It's because in order to engage in that kind of stuff, you have to leave the space that you're connected with. And so one way I might give an example about how important that is we're only 3 years out from the end of Standing Rock, right?
Quick overview. What was Standing Rock?
So there was a oil company that was building a pipeline through North Dakota. And their intent was originally to build it north of the capital of the state called Bismarck. But the Bismarck citizens were like, no, that's too close to us. We don't want you to do that. So they moved it to an area that was just like less than a mile north of the border of the Standing Rock Reservation, the Indian Reservation. And the problem with that, amongst many, is that border was built by colonial powers. It was still through Standing Rock land. Specifically, it was through sacred places that were used in sacred rituals historically, and also through graves. And because people would argue when that was going on, like, well, it's outside of the reservation, they have no reason to complain. Like, well, the reason why it's outside of the reservation was because of horrible colonization, because it used to be at 100% Standing Rock land. But also, like, does that matter when you look at the fact that your ancestors are buried there, or that you have literally thousands of years of a relationship with that place in performing sacred rites? So the way I'm using Standing Rock as an example is like people want it to be like, well, it actually isn't your land anymore. It's not really that big a deal, but it is. And that connection is so powerful that what people were experiencing was the fact that not only the destruction of these sacred parts of indigenous identity, specifically Standing Rock indigenous identity.
Just because someone else took your land doesn't somehow magically make it less important to you?
I wouldn't necessarily phrase it the same way, but maybe we can.
Okay.
Maybe the land has a personhood to it, except that its personhood is directly connected with you. So it's part of your personhood. The land that you were born on, the land that you live on, the land that your ancestors lived on. That's part of your identity. Like, I hear you wanting to compare it to other things to make it easier to understand, but it's really hard to, because it's not really an idea that is very prominent in Western thinking.
Is it reasonable to say, in the same way that music and a language and stories and practices make it, so do the places in which those things occur, that it is just another part of culture?
Yeah, I 100% agree with what you just said, yes. I've always felt that because of this, I've always felt, the book sometimes are like, oh, here's the other spheres that this tradition is really good at. That correspondence should also be a specialty of the Dreamspeakers, because their understanding of connection to space is so powerful and thorough in a lot of ways that, again, like Western thinking, more independence-focused, more imperialistic history societies aren't really going to recognize. I think it's easier in general for non-Indigenous folk to think of packing up their lives and moving to a different state if it was going to give them some economic gain, right? It's much harder to do that for Indigenous folk.
Is there any analog to the idea of an economic worldview? Is attempting to make that comparison just folly?
Yes, but the way that Western society views economics is in this kind of like weird, like we can somehow adjust the way we are living our society to make it so that we're always constantly producing more. Every day we're producing more than the day before. Yeah, even economists will be like, oh yeah, there's some problems with that theory, even though that's the theory that they are engaged in, right? So the way that Western thinking looks at economy is about accruing wealth, also the value of spreading it around, but by and large accruing it in order to be able to do that. Whereas I would say that if you're going to look at a more indigenous view, a less Western view, a more indigenous view of that kind of thing, you wouldn't be looking at wealth so much as you would be looking at building relationship. Economics in an indigenous point of view is more about what's important about trade is not accruing. What's important about trade is building a relationship with the person you're trading with. Probably like a million examples I can use of that, but probably the best one is the story of the potlatch. A potlatch is a social practice that happens primarily historically in what is now called the Pacific Northwest of the US and the West Coast of Canada, amongst the many different tribes that are there who all deserve to be specifically recognized, but anthropologists largely will call them various Coast Salish tribes. And not all of them engage in this, but a lot of them did. And essentially a potlatch is a practice that usually happens in the winter months, so not necessarily only, it could happen for other special occasions, where the headman, the person who is like in the head of essentially the governing body of the tribe, would spend all of his ability to accrue as much, I'm going to say why this accrual is different, but he would accrue as much forms of wealth as possible, and they might be as simple as like rare beads, or it might be like fish or food or whatever, like all kinds of different things could be. Eventually, as things got more colonized, money was included in these, and it still is today, money's included. But the purpose was for him to throw this big party and give out everything he owned to everyone who came to the party. And the more he was able to give, the better his gifts, the more exciting they were, the more beneficial to the people he was giving them to. First of all, the more powerful his relationship was with the people he was giving them to, but also the more kind of status he earned in their eyes. And that is kind of what kept him being the guy in charge. So like by giving up everything you own, you gained power, which is literally the opposite of how Western economy thinks. It's like you get power by the more you own.
And this is a fascinating thing because the Canadian government banned potlatches for a while as part of a comprehensive attempt to tamp down on Indigenous practices. So
it was for that reason, but also it was because it was hurting the Canadian economy because there are different styles of economy, right? So for them, what they wanted to be happening was so at that point you had a lot of Indigenous folk working in factories, like canning factories primarily in that area, mostly for seafood. They would pay them, and their expectation, and as you can understand, as we expect the Western economy to work, is that once they had that money, they would then put that money back into the system by buying products that they needed to survive or whatever. That's just nice stuff they wanted with their money. But instead, they would save it and not spend any of it and wait for a potlatch to go give it away somewhere where people aren't even necessarily going to be spending anything because it's so far removed from the places from the markets. And so what it ended up being is like they were sinking money into the workers that was not coming back to the factories, and it was messing with their economy. So that's why they outlawed it.
Oh, interesting. And I mean, the idea of competitive altruism is found in a fair number of cultures. You have the Koha of the Maori. The people that we would call the Vikings would often settle disputes by taking turns throwing bigger and bigger parties.
Yeah.
Which it's interesting because it's like it resulted in fewer deaths due to battle, but more deaths due to alcoholism. But we don't need to dwell on that. And is that something that you think could be brought into Mage, where you would have? Was this ever a competitive thing, or was it strictly someone who had a position of power showing why they had the position of power? Could I bring this into a Mage game and have two Dreamspeakers settle a dispute or chantry leadership through competitive altruism? Is there something we can grab into the game for it?
Yes. So I think that this specific practice that I'm describing, if you pull back the curtain on a little bit, we're talking about how this is a more communally focused paradigm, right? We don't care as much about as accrual of wealth. We care about maintaining our community and making our community strong, which includes, providing them with things they need by giving them the gifts, but also by maintaining a system of government that is based off of empowering the community. So yeah, I think you could. I think you'd still want to be careful, as I would say with literally any other specific indigenous practice, about being respectful of where it's coming from. I would say, like, if you're playing, you mentioned some other people that do similar practice, like the Maori. Like a Maori character probably wouldn't call it a potlatch, but he or she might still engage in a similar practice, but I'd be careful about what words you're using. In fact, there was a short sentence in second edition Dreamspeakers where they said something that I was like, this is dumb, and I don't remember. Oh yeah, it was like something like, it was like in the one of the earliest chapters when they're talking about before the Dreamspeakers joined the council, and they said, the quote in the book is like, our tradition is a potlatch of diverse peoples and cultures, and I'm like,
yeah, it's on page 84. I remember reading it and being like, you didn't word good.
I mean,
sorry.
I know what they're trying to say.
Yeah.
I understood what they were trying to say because I know what a potlatch is, but also
I feel like they wanted to say a potluck, but missed.
Well, that's where that word comes from.
Oh, potluck comes from potlatch?
Yes.
I mean, isn't that also the origin of the cringy term Indian giver?
No, the cringy term Indian giver, well, I mean, it could be associated with that, but it has a lot more to do in general, again, with different styles of economies and different meanings of what trade was. And so sometimes people, Western people, white people, colonizers, would make trades that that kind of trade didn't really exist in the style of thinking of indigenous thinking, or two, it was kind of understood in indigenous thinking that if you were to make that kind of trade, it would not be permanent. So a really easy example of that one is, everyone jokes about, oh, New York was bought for a couple of beads, right? But the reason that happened was because the people, quote unquote, making the trade were like, you can't own this land, so sure, give us these beads, we'll say you can live here, but like it doesn't mean to them the same thing. And so then sometimes deals would get, at least in the eyes of the colonizers, would be like reneged upon, and they'd be like, oh, the Indian giver taking things, when in reality, if you look at the whole history of treaties, and we know who the Indian givers actually were. White givers is the right term.
Yeah. And I mean, that was a case where the people who had made the trade came back and are like, yo, it's your quote unquote land. You still need to house us and everything. That's part of the agreement of saying that this is yours. You have the expectation of hosting us and letting us have access to it and everything. You're the ones who don't get it. And Island at the Center of the World on the history of New York City has a wonderful section on that history and the initial misunderstandings, as it were, until guns got involved. So we could introduce the idea of a potlatch to a game where instead of settling a dispute with Kurdamane, you could have two people saying, this is how powerful I am. I'm giving away all my talismans.
Yeah. Yeah, that would be a big one. Yeah, it'd be hard to deny how powerful that person is.
Yeah, here's Matas, or something like that. And that can be something that would be fascinating, especially if the characters encounter a group that is used to a gift economy. They are a guest somewhere, they receive something, they think it is a gift, and social tension starts rising when they fail to reciprocate or give something else back. And that is a safe-ish way to introduce this new cultural idea that may be alien to your character's social paradigm, but that you can bring into your Mage game.
I hear your specific separation of social paradigm, but you can 100% apply this to your actual paradigm too, because you can use the idea of a gift economy with how you are working with spirits and how you're associating with that particular sphere, and also honestly any of the others, since a lot of the ways of Dreamspeakers view all of them is that they're still making some kind of social relationship with spirits when they're summoning like forces or something like that.
Okay. One of the things that is tricky about the Dreamspeaker paradigm that I run into, and I think it was super complicated in 20th edition, was the idea that if you are using forces, but your focus for that is chiminage with a spirit associated with fire, do I or don't I need spirit, and how do I still get that effect to work? Do you have any recommendations for storytellers on how to navigate that? Like, the term I've heard before is the idea of paradigm spirits, that if you want to do a forces effect and you're trying to interface with an appropriate spiritual entity to enact that, you're not actually necessarily using the spirit sphere, but this kind of exchange or whatever your normal focus is that involves spirits can be invoked, and you can still get this forces effect. Any recommendations on how to navigate that? And the answer may just be no.
I have a recommendation, but I think a lot of people won't like it. However, I think there's establishment for where I'm coming from. The separation of the spheres themselves is an aspect of paradigm shift that, by and large, if I recall historically, the council is mostly responsible for. But there have been times previous to the forming of the Council of Nine when they weren't separated into 9 spheres in the exact same way.
We have all of Dark Ages Mage, where it was where it was pillars and you had a foundation.
The pillars.
Yeah.
And through that, it's been kind of established that using magic as defined by the 9 spheres of reality is not necessarily the only one right true way to do it. And I would say that, now that said, it's not that necessarily helpful to someone who's worried about how am I doing the rules the right way. I would say that the way the Dreamspeaker paradigm works is, by and large, every single enaction of quote-unquote magic is through some relationship with the spirits, which is why I said it's so important. I think it's really important to look at their paradigm as being animistic, because you can really understand everything through that lens if you look at it that way. But I would say spirit is more about a very direct interaction and relationship with the spirit you're asking for help from, and you can apply to any spirit. And you can do stuff eventually like spirit horsing or like exercising and stuff like that, where those other things would never really let you get into, crossing into the Umbra. Kind of what your paradigm would be doing is if, for example, you want your staff to hit harder. Okay, let's say it's a wooden staff. You'd be using matter, but your paradigm would be, I'm communicating with this spirit by offering it, like you call it offering it shimonage, which is a very specifically game term. But I would say by building a relationship with it, by respecting it and honoring it in some way. And it could be as simple as like, I'm polishing it. But by polishing it, you're showing that wood person, that piece of wood that has personhood, that you respect it. And you're hoping by showing that respect to it that you're going to get some kind of like working reciprocal relationship, which in this case is my stake hits harder. You're using matter, but that's like your paradigm is saying you're building a relationship with that spirit.
So in that case, the paradigm is still animism, but the focus in this case is going to be the ritual of doing something to that staff, like to translate it into bare-knuckle game terms.
Yeah, the foci, if we want to get bare-knuckle game terms, you could define it as the ritual that I'm showing respect, or like the polishing ritual, right? Mm-hmm. But I would pull it back just a little bit to fit in the paradigm and say it's really a matter of like doing something to show that you have, like to build your relationship with that spirit. And it could be polishing in this case, but maybe next time they want some other effect for polishing doesn't make as much sense. But as long as there's some kind of engagement where you're like, I'm showing you that I see you as an equal, please help me out.
So it would almost make sense that in your focus section, you are more or less outlining the nature of the different relationships you could theoretically have with the spirits of the world around you, more than even just listing spirits.
Yes.
Also, in game terms, that gives you a useful way to have, I don't want to say effects at the ready, but if you indicate to your storyteller in my downtime, I'm going to do this because I think in the next few sessions I may need to use this ability. I want to be on good terms with these entities so that I can suddenly invoke them. You haven't pulled some sort of weird time juju. You did the focus, you did the work, but you get to pull it out when it's thematically necessary without having to do the hermetic thing of like, hold on, let me draw a chalk outline for the next 4.5 hours. Do you have any recommendations, like going through those relationships, what types of chimonage we might want to look at, and also what is chimonage?
It's offering something to a spirit that they like enough to do what you want, right?
The other two alternatives in the system are hermetics, have ancient pacts where they flat out order an entity to do something.
Yeah, they bind them and stuff.
Yeah, because they have some sort of agreement that they've done with a Celestine or an Incarna or something.
Yeah, which canonically Dreamspeakers have a huge problem with.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And then on the other end, you kind of have werewolves who are half spirit themselves and can kind of get away with a lot of stuff to being like, yo, help another friend out, which mages don't often have the ability to do, and certainly not on the level of a werewolf.
Yeah, that's kind of how they explain the shortcut of if you don't have time to do shimonage, you can just spend gnosis because you're essentially the same thing and you're exchanging something that matters to both of you.
Does it make sense in Mage to offer your characters something like a devil's bargain, where they're in a tight bind and they make a request and they're like, yeah, I know I can't pay you now, but I will give you something super great later? Is that something that would make sense, or does that kind of break down the whole relationship?
I would say it depends on the kind of spirit. I would say by and large, the spirits I'm thinking of when I'm talking about that I think Dreamspeakers are more likely to make relationships with, I wouldn't call it a devil's bargain, but it would be like, yes, I will make this up to you. I owe
okay.
Your Umbrood this X thing, right? Because of the way you phrase it with the devil's bargain. Like if it was potentially something that was really had a really deleterious effect in the future, that might be a more negatively associated spirit, like a spirit of pain or hate or something like that, doing something like that.
I also play Blades in the Dark, where a devil's bargain is a game term that I accidentally included, which is a thing where I will give you, the storyteller has the ability to offer someone, I will give you this boost, but you have, this bad thing or this necessary thing is going to happen later. And that's kind of the quid pro quo that you make with the storyteller. So that is a game mechanical term that I probably should have used. Yeah.
That's fair.
Now, does it make sense to talk in generic spirit terms? Are we doing any of these groups a disservice by saying the spirit of my staff?
I think it's fine. I think it's fine because, one, if we are going to get into specific terms, usually those are not terms that we need to be sharing with non-Indigenous folk. So it's okay to just use game stuff, in my opinion. That said, I will say on the flip side of that, the game has created spirits that were supposed to be more sacred and just for Indigenous folk in specific scenarios that are now like everyone uses in their everyday gaming. And if I were being a conscientious, which I am, I'm just in generally speaking, if I were being a conscientious storyteller, I'd work really hard on some of those spirits and maybe rewrite them in different ways, or maybe only include them in the way they're written if I'm certain that that matches the cultural background and paradigm of the specific character. But like, I'm sure you want some examples, but like, I think they've written some Kachinas and they've written some Manitou and stuff like that. That I'm like, these are very specific and have very specific relationships and sacred power to specific groups of people. And it's not really appropriate to use them as like a spirit I can summon to get my job done.
So it seems to be stick with the super generic stuff unless you're willing to do the homework and know the context in which you. Yeah. I'm just a white guy. Do you have any recommendations when I'm doing my homework? If I'm introducing a Dreamspeaker character or an Indigenous person character, do you have any like sniff tests you can recommend? When I'm looking through material, one of the things that always throws me off is when I encounter a source that says Native Americans believe blah de blah, and I'm like, that's a broad ass brush. But like when we talked to Josh Heath about Norse magic, he's like, oh, by the way, here are some terms you should definitely avoid. That if you see those, run screaming. Do you have any recommendations, either good scholastic sources to pursue, or alternatively signs that you're on the wrong track?
Signs that you're on the wrong track are going to be a lot of them where you think to look first, and it's that, did a white person write this? And a lot of that academic volume of work is written by white anthropologists. So my suggestion, if you want to do that, but I plead with you, please be respectful, be conscientious, and the best thing ultimately to do is, if you aren't sure, take one small step back and just call it the wood spirit, right? If you're not sure. As long as you're being respectful and careful, I actually highly recommend just reading stories or listening to storytellers, because even though it doesn't seem immediately obvious, but that the act of storytelling is also part of the Dreamseeker magical paradigm. And it actually comes up in a really cool way in Dreamseeker Revised. You can please certain spirits by telling stories about them. So, for example, in my own background, Chiricahua stories, there's so many stories about coyote. And there's also a really heavy awareness and respect of the role of coyote in my background. I think that there is a direct relationship between how much time and energy you're putting into telling coyote stories and what kind of power he has. And I think even as a white person, you can agree with me that if you're like, what's a powerful, indigenous spirit that I need to think of, coyote's probably pretty high up on the list.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, Coyote and Raven are usually the first two people think of.
International Fellowship of White People, our annual meeting, top 5 stereotypical things associated with North Americans. That's 2 and 4, actually. Yeah. I just consulted our list.
Okay.
There are certain sacred terms that we should just not say. And you mentioned the term that is used in Werewolf to describe younger brother. Are there any other things that we should just flat out not have in our games, that if they pop up, you're almost fundamentally using it wrong?
The answer is yes. It's such a long list. It's really hard to be like, here's a quick and easy list of words to avoid. The best thing you can do is, if you are choosing to use words from a very specific tribe or culture, if it's in your power, try to find people from that group that are speaking on things like that, on issues of appropriation, for example, and see if those terms come up. Or if you, even better, ask someone. I couldn't begin to tell you if there's a specific term you shouldn't be using that's an Iroquoian term, because I have zero connection to that other than my academic studies, which don't always come across that. I feel like for the most part, there's stuff you're allowed to say. I would be careful anytime that it's like the description of what you're looking at is like, this is an evil spirit. I would be wary, because usually that's something you don't want to say the name of. Also, I would throw out here, when we were writing Gods and Monsters, we made one of the big villains of that story Big Owl, which comes from my own heritage from Apache stories. Big Owl also has a relationship with Killer of Enemies, but I didn't write really much other than a brief mention. I wasn't writing about Killer of Enemies, and the reason is because Killer of Enemies deserves a lot more respect than being included in a fun little fantasy role-playing game. I'm not going to do that.
And you mentioned Big Owl, and one of the fascinating things that comes to me is the fact that, okay, is another thing that we can do to kind of show players how much wider the world is different cultures have different associations with different animals. The one that always threw me off is I thought people thought Athena was wise because she associated with owls, but it was the other way around. That Athena had an owl became a symbol of wisdom, and that is not common globally. What is the association with Big Owl?
Okay, two things. I can talk to you about more directly Big Al himself as a figure in Apache stories, but also I will add on to that. Yes, 100%. By and large, North American indigenous folk have a very different opinion of what owl represents than Europeans. And the difference of opinion, I actually think is really interesting. I talk about this sometimes, but because it is a symbol, even though, however misguided the transformation was, owl for Europeans is a symbol of knowledge and wisdom and like learning. And I would more specifically say Western learning. Now, owl in North America for indigenous folk, again, painting a brush, but I would say it's pretty common, is a symbol of death. Owl is death and fear and nothing good. Is owl flies over you at night, you're fucked. The idea that the symbol of like Western wisdom is also the symbol of indigenous death, I think is a really powerful thing to look at and examine.
But the general rule you've given is stick with non-specific names. That is perfectly fine. You're not doing anyone any real offense there. If it's an evil spirit, probably don't use its name, and try and do your homework.
I would say really quick, the worst offense of the non-specific names is more that you're not investing the time to learn. Mage is such a good game, and it should be something that you always use as an opportunity to learn. So the fact that you're not doing it, I would say is kind of like a little bit of an evil, but also I would say is the least of them.
Yeah, okay. So it's one of those things where, for instance, I had a character in my game that was from the Ghost Wheel Society, and a person picked the area. They tried to track down as many names as they could to be able to invoke it appropriately at the table, but sometimes the character needed to talk to the spirit of a fluorescent light bulb. And he wasn't able to find the spirit of a fluorescent light bulb. So he's like, yeah, going to talk to the spirit of the fluorescent light bulb. And that seemed entirely appropriate.
The interesting thing about Ghost Wheel Society is because of the way that they're written is interacting with spirits of technology, that you're not going to even find a lot of or not but someone told a sacred story about this spirit because it just doesn't exist.
Does it make sense for many of these groups within the Dreamspeakers to talk about an idea of ascension? Does any sort of analog to that exist within some of these worldviews?
Here's another yes and no. I couldn't paint a brush about this one. There's been lots of things where I'm like, I'm willing to say there's a commonality here. I couldn't do this here. However, I do think you can sometimes, not for every culture, but sometimes find specific stories that fit into that kind of idea. There's one, I know it's a PNW story, like a Pacific Northwest story. It's Coast Salish, but I can't remember which tribe. There's one about how there was a point when the sky was touching the earth and people were like jumping up and getting stuck in the sky, and it was a big problem. And so a bunch of the different leaders got together and chose one word to mean jump in all their languages. And then they told their people at once to jump and smash down the earth so that the sky would separate from it. But as a result, that several people got stuck in the sky forever and became the stars. Anyway, that's an example of a story that I think you could potentially explore as a translation into Ascension. But also, again, be a little respectful and be careful about how you're doing that. The one other thing I might look at is that there is kind of a common viewpoint that you are living your life in a way like you want to be someone's ancestor, right? You want to be someone's ancestor who helped them. Because when you think about how your relationship with your ancestors and how that benefits you, and you want to be that for someone else. So if you can live your life that way, I would argue you could see that as being maybe a potential road to ascension.
And is that one of those things where the term ancestor is literal? Like, for instance, should a character that wants to be a great ancestor have a family? Is that something that you should be generally introducing into that narrative? Or is it safe to say that you're a good uncle or something like that?
Both things, I think. Okay. You don't have to be like a direct descendant or a direct ascendant. Here's an example. I'm Chiricahua Apache. The most famous Chiricahua Apache in history is Goyathle, or the other name is Geronimo. I am 99% sure I have almost no actual blood heritage. You couldn't trace me back there. However, I view him as an inspirational ancestor because of what he did for our people and how he fought the U.S. to preserve our people and to save our people. It's less about direct line and more, I guess, about your cultural background and kind of what you've done to make the lives better of the people that come after you.
Among the North American indigenous cultures you're familiar with, is ancestor veneration or ancestor worship a thing? Like, are the spirits of the departed, or is there an idea that they transmigrate into the environment? Are they entities that would be directly addressed, or does that not really make sense?
So usually when people talk about ancestor worship, they're talking more about Eastern cultures. And so I would not compare it to that because there's a lot more, I guess, direct relationship and manipulation there. I'm not using manipulation in a negative way, but I mean like the ability to coerce and have an ancestor do something based off of what you're doing. I'm only hesitant to say ancestor worship because of that association with that term. But there is a very big veneration for ancestors, and it's kind of your sacred duty to do well by them. And one of the reasons, people are like, oh, it doesn't, Native Americans going off and protecting this patch of land just because like someone 1,000 years ago was buried there. They're just being weirdos and we don't care about that. But it's a big deal. It's a big deal because it's your job to protect and preserve and honor and respect the people that lived and died so that you could be here today.
Is that something that we can bring into Mage at all? I understand that certainly the idea of protecting sacred spaces are important ones, but is that something that would ever get woven into magical practice? Or is that like a hermetic who's a block captain trying to draw upon their position with a homeowners association as a source of magic? No, it's just something they have to do. It's not necessarily woven into their magical practice. And maybe why they do something, but they're never going to use their homeowners association agreement probably as a focus.
I would say that you could use it as a focus, and you could use it as a really important aspect of your paradigm. And you could also use it as a really powerful part of just your general character ties, like the way you interact with your node or the way you interact with your allies. However, the one thing I would probably there might be a way to do this, but without me really thinking about it, that I might discourage people from doing is having things like I summon my ancestors, like, they'd go and fight for me. Like, there's probably a way you can do that, but I would be really, really careful, and I don't know what to tell listeners what that is right now. Like, let's just put this as part of like the reason why my character is invested in interacting with society and the changes they're trying to make. And you could be like, I am a living example of what my ancestors died for, and I might call upon them and like be like, I am the great grandson of so and so, and maybe use it as a way to like access some quintessence or something through Prime. But like by and large, I would be careful about bringing like ghost Indians into your story and stuff like that, and be really careful about that.
But it wouldn't be unreasonable that if a character is fortifying themselves for a battle, that they use a rote or effect to temporarily increase their physical stats, that part of that is going to be reflecting on their duty and obligation.
Sure.
And so on. So it's one of those things where you're not necessarily directly interacting with them. You probably wouldn't necessarily ask them for advice in the same way, again, as Josh, he said, you could literally go ask Grandpa at a funeral barrow what I should do. There's not really an analog to that.
Like in the vein of what you're saying, that I always thought, like, how in Dreamspeakers they gave them access to a specific werewolf merit, but I always felt like that was a bad choice, and maybe they should have considered doing ancestors, but a specific version, which was the one where, like you said, you could call on some stats. You could be like, I'm empowered by what my ancestors have done for me. Today I'm better at hunting, raise my survival skills, whatever, for the day. Like, I think that's an interesting way to do it, and a more respectful way to do it. But also, if you use that werewolf ancestors merit, they also let you talk with them, and that one I might steer away from or be really careful if you did want to go into that territory. I see people do stuff like, I'm a spirit master, so I can destroy ancestor spirits. Technically, yes, but please don't do that in this game. It's so disrespectful. So that's why I'm really careful about saying, oh, do we want to include them in this game? Because I don't know what people are going to do to them.
I have talked to more than one writer who brings a viewpoint and understanding from a group that has been historically marginalized that has that same concern. Am I going to be widening the number of people who understand this cultural practice, or am I just giving more fodder to people who want to abuse it and who can do so more specifically? Am
I turning this sacred thing into like some group of white dudes, monster of the week? Let's have a good time and drink Mountain Dew and kill these things. Like, it's hard sometimes to talk about this stuff.
I fully understand. And speaking of which, we talked about terms in Werewolf that should be avoided. Are there any in Mage that have made their way into the lexicon that we should kind of flat out avoid?
Well, that one background that I mentioned that Dreamspeakers can access that comes from Werewolf. Totem does not mean what it means. It shouldn't be used in Werewolf. It shouldn't be used in Dreamspeakers. It's less that it's offensive, more that it's not what it means, and kind of using it for the wrong thing is offensive. However, I would say like Dreamspeakers honestly mostly did a much better job than Werewolf, Mage in general, did a better job than werewolf in avoiding some of the worst terms. The one thing I'd say is they completely removed this in Dreamspeakers Revised. In the second edition tradition book, they have like the long list of all the other terms that they call themselves, right? Including the Kavadi, which we end up using in 20th. Some of those I might question. One of the most obvious ones that they put in there is Sami. And I'm like, no, that's one specific group of people. You don't call all Dreamspeakers that. That is not appropriate. So there's a few things like that. But like as far as like the super common parlance stuff, Totem's probably the biggest offender that I can think of.
And we can generally replace that in Mage with something like Spirit Patron.
Yeah, no. They should do that in Werewolf, too.
It's allies, but it's a spirit, or something like that. Or it's a mentor, but it's a spirit. Are there any terms that are in the game that kind of fundamentally misrepresent the real-world practice? The two that come to mind is when people talk about either the weird or karma.
Sure.
Those are generally fundamental misrepresentations. And the one that I personally am the most concerned about is when people start throwing the term medicine around.
Well, it's kind of hokey. What I'll say about medicine is let's draw the curtain back a little bit onto why there's a different word. It is true that some, and not the majority, indigenous North American people use that term. If you want to translate it over to a more European point of view, white magic versus black magic. Medicine, right? Magic that has a healing, bolstering property, medicine. What you're mostly looking at there is that by and large, these societies, these cultures, that the Dreamspeakers, the people who wrote Dreamspeakers are drawing inspiration from, tend to have very clearly, strictly defined lines between what is magic that is good, that good people practice, that, you know, what might be called in certain cultures medicine men or medicine women, or shamans, or, you know, which again is not appropriate, but like just to get an idea of who I mean. You would want to use that because if those people were engaging in sorcery, which tends to be kind of the other word, like that gets translated over to magic, those are almost universally depicted as villainous. So like in mage terms, a Dreamspeaker would be practicing quote unquote medicine, again, might not be culturally appropriate, but what you're looking at is the differentiation of what they're using their magic to do. Whereas a Nafandi or a Marker's Nightmare, there's something like a vision mocker. They would absolutely be practitioners of sorcery / magic, and that's how people would be seen, and they would be excised from their society. They would be no longer connected to their society.
Now, if I did want to introduce that character, sorry to introduce the little aside, is that character simply going to do the normal chiminage process with different spirits, or are they going to start demanding and forcing other spirits to do something to their benefit? Is there an established role for the quote-unquote bad guy?
Again, I can't say anything universal. I'm just going to draw on my knowledge of ideas and practices. I would say that I think it would be more likely that they would continue with their original paradigm, which is kind of like, oh, binding them doesn't really make sense. However, they would start to choose to work with more, in game terms, corrupted spirits, more entropic, wormy spirits. Like, again, we mentioned earlier, pain and hate spirits, banes. Like, they would go towards spirits of evil ideas and things, but with the same paradigm. I guess it could be possible to do the other thing too, but I see, honestly, I see going in that direction closer to a Dreamspeaker who becomes more technocratic-minded as opposed to Nephandic-minded.
So a technocrat or a hermetic that just starts bossing things around. So the question is this: how can we as storytellers avoid overly broad application of indigenous belief? How can we avoid taking something that is a Sioux belief and practice and jamming that on the Inuit or the Athabascan or vice versa? To take that back, I guess the question is, what is a good way of telling if a practice or belief is somewhat widespread or is super narrow and we're kind of doing this ham-handed mix and match?
I feel like the obvious answer is just like read about the culture you're representing. Like I can try and reach for more than that, but it's like, again, do Cherokee wear headdresses? No. Don't have your Cherokee character run around in a headdress. That's ridiculous. On the other side, let me throw out this too, though. While I would say amongst indigenous circles, and I would say more specifically academic indigenous circles, it's understood that, like, you know, dream catchers belong to a specific tribe. We also have been subject to kind of like a side effect of being colonized, which is called pan-Indianism. Do you want me to stop and describe that?
Please do.
Pan-Indianism is actually kind of what you're asking about here. It's the idea that we can all be one group. And in some ways it's positive, because pan-Indianism is how it's kind of like the way in which it wasn't just a Standing Rock tribe standing up against the pipeline. It, like, tribes came from all over the country and from different countries. because we were like, we're indigenous siblings, we're here to help. It's also how the American Indian movement got together, because there are a bunch of different tribes coming together. If you think about it, it's how Custer got killed, because it was several different tribes that came together to kill him. So in some ways, there's like positive ways to look at pan-Indianism, the way it draws us together to fight for a common cause. On the other, it also ends up in cultural erasure, because you're like, oh yeah, all Indians wear headdresses and all Indians use dream catchers, which isn't true.
The biggest comparison I have is one of the things that I think is a disservice is I have seen this happen with sub-Saharan art, where someone finds something and they post it on Instagram, people love it, and now all of a sudden rich people are going to this particular village that is outside the historical Mad Zimbabwe looking for a particular pot to impress all of their friends. Mm-hmm. And people come the next year and they say, where are the pots? And the artists go, we're artists. We keep making new and different things. We trade ideas with one another. Mm-hmm. So to some extent, I feel like we are doing a disservice if we don't also recognize that cultural exchange can still happen, as long as we do a good job of saying, this is what is being absorbed, we understand where it comes from, and this is how we're integrating it into what we have. And I feel like that is an avenue where a Dreamspeaker player would be able to, maybe in a time of duress, say, hey, I've spent time with others that have similar foundational beliefs, and I learned this interesting thing, and I have grown in terms of my worldview to incorporate that. Is that a reasonable thing to do, or is that mostly just going to result in cultural erasure?
Well, I guess it depends on how you approach it, because as long as you're approaching it in the context of like, I'm trying to explore the impact this has, and not just like be like, this happened and we're done, then I think it could be a useful storytelling tool. I kind of remembered why I was talking about Pan-Indianism, and it's because even though dream catchers belong, and it's related to what you're saying, even though dream catchers belong to one tribe, one group of people today in contemporary Indian country, lots of us have them. I have one hanging in my wall right here. It's not associated with my tribes at all, because it has become kind of like a symbol that's been adopted in more indigenous communities. There's probably some other examples of that. You know, like,
can I use the example, for instance, of the Celtic cross being used by people who are Irish but in no way religious to just identify Irishness?
Oh yeah, because it's part of your Irish identity. Yeah, like it's the way that symbol moved around is probably not in the exact same direction, but I think it's a fair comparison. That said, I still think it's really important to like explore, like, okay, yes, even though I have a dream catcher on my wall, I'm not part of the tribe that those originally belonged to, but like that has become part of my identity as it's associated with the rest of my community. I wouldn't make one. That's the difference, I would say. I would never make one. I would think that would be inappropriate. Mine was handmade for me. It was also not store-bought, so I would not buy one in the store ever. I think that's sacrilegious. Did you see that picture I posted of thing I saw in TJ Maxx that was like a mix between like that hand symbol, a Samha symbol, and like a dream catcher, and it was all done in like macrame, and I was like, oh my God, what is this?
The only one I've really opined on, like cornfields versus wheat fields, I have run through both. Wheat fields are very short. I can see over them. Nothing is going to come up from behind me. Cornfields are terrifying because what we've done to them, the corn's 45 feet tall and blocks out the sun.
Also, corn doesn't belong to you. It's not your friend. Corn is actively trying to kill white people across the country, and I support it.
I'm not going to say that you're wrong. A cat, candy hearts.
Basically what it was that hand symbol mixed into a dream catcher that had like macrame feathers. And I was like, how much more gross can you get with this appropriation? It's mixing two different religious beliefs. You're selling it in a TJ Maxx, and also you're using like one of the widest craft skills to add in like an extra flair.
I would love to see your hierarchy of basic bitch white crafts. Like if we ever do a Patreon, I want that to be part of the list. So the two big questions I have that are left are, one, I find it interesting how the notion of traditions has changed over time. So in first edition, traditions were kind of beliefs, that the Celestial Chorus had a monotheism beyond monotheism, and the Virtual Adepts had a computer beyond computers. And the Dreamspeakers had the fundamental ideas that actually inspired the cultures and not the other way around. Like 1 EU Thanatoi are indicated as the sleeper belief was inspired by Thanatoic magic, not the other way around. And then later on in Revised, we get this idea that it's a worldview with it's a paradigm, but with a political block behind it. And the Akashiana is going to include Greek Stoics, and it's going to include the contemplative solitary masters of the high Arctic, and any number of people that are like perfection of the mind and body is how I pursue ascension. What are ways in which we can have indigenous cultures kind of in almost all the traditions. Like, what is a First Nations Thanatoic going to look like, or a First Nations Celestial Chorus member going to look like, or interesting places where you think it would pop up. And one of the big ones was, what do the First Nations look like, or the North American indigenous cultures look like in the technocracy?
I think before we started recording, I mentioned the sad news that I was originally going to be writing on technocracy and didn't, but what I was going to be writing on that was specifically indigenous technocrats. So what I would say for the purpose of this is that I actually can't think of any tradition or convention that indigenous people couldn't belong in, because indigenous people are not in any way whatsoever defined by the beliefs of their ancestors. And I don't want to say that people don't believe that today, but like when those beliefs were universal, that no longer exists because of colonization. Those beliefs are no longer universal. And you could even employ some of those beliefs into, like, I honestly can't think of a single one that I couldn't find a way to write that character.
Can you spitball a few examples? Like, the ones that I would be endlessly fascinated are, what does an indigenous technocrat look like? What does an indigenous Thanatoic look like? And what does an indigenous chorister look like?
Let me start with chorister, because I actually think it's the easiest. So as you are, I'm sure, well aware, as a result of colonization, there is a huge amount of Christianity and Catholicism all throughout Indian country. It's not uncommon. What you'll hear is that most Indians, instead of being like God and Jesus, they'll say creator. You're looking at, when you hear creator, often you're listening to an indigenous person talking about their Christianity. Okay. Whatever flavor it might be. Some people might have problems with this, but I don't. If you want to move past the gross colonization aspects of it, the paradigm of the Celestial Chorus is pretty congruous with the paradigm of the Dreamspeakers. It's just that the Celestial Chorus has a much more like rigidly defined definition of what they think those holy and sacred aspects of being are, whereas the Dreamspeakers are like, no, it's everything. However, it's really easy to shift between those two, in my opinion. You're still looking at, there's an understanding of the divinity that is outside of the self that must be respected. Euthanatos. I'm glad you asked about Euthanatos, because they're one of my other favorite traditions. I mentioned earlier about the idea that once people are gone, plants and trees will continue. I also am thinking along the lines of something that I think is really hard for non-Indigenous folk to understand, especially when we're talking about the World of Darkness, because the World of Darkness deals with this theme really heavily, is what it's like to live through the end times, the apocalypse, Ragnarok, whatever you want to call it, like the world ending. It is like the theme of Werewolf, right? But also it is like a major theme throughout all the games. It's kind of cool, but also kind of scary, and everything's going to hell, and the whole world as you knew it is just destroyed, and you have to learn how to adjust while you're surviving through it if you can. We've done that. We did it. We are doing it now. We're still surviving through it. And so I feel like Indigenous folk have such a powerful understanding and connection to the idea of what dying means in a larger metaphysical sense, what a cyclic life means, what it means to endure destruction and then come back and create again. That you can take an Indigenous character who really focuses on those ideas and translate them into someone who ends up joining the Chakravanti. There's other things you can look at in that too, but that's kind of mostly what I think about when I think about how to play an Indigenous Chakravanti.
Indigenous Hollow One?
Oh, I am an Indigenous Hollow One. What are you talking about? That's who I am.
So to me, the Hollow Ones generally break down into three groups. You have gutter mages, romantics, and postmoderns. Mm-hmm. What do you feel as if any of those mesh particularly well?
You can honestly, you can do all of them. It just depends on who you're talking about. So the gutter mages are really easy, because one of the truths of life of being an Indigenous person, not everyone grows up in the res. A lot of people grow up urban, or they call us urban Indians. I did. I grew up in LA. And you also have that, and that happens for reasons of like dispossession of land and laws that force people to move and stuff like that. But also it happens in the case of Seattle. You have the Duwamish tribe, which is what Chief Seattle comes from, right? And Seattle, the city of Seattle, landed on his tribe's land. And so you have people who have lived there forever, but are now like a really small part of that community, but are still like the first people of that community that are in that place. And because you are living such a life of dispossession, low resources, you have a lot of like Indigenous folks who are kind of surviving day to day in the streets of the city. And that's kind of like that Hollow One group's theme, is the way you survive that way. I think a big theme of that group is survival and the way they survive. So I think that they fit in, like people like that fit into that really well. When it comes to like romantics, man, have you ever read any like indigenous poets like Joy Harjo, and you'll see that we're really good about writing about sad shit. Which romantics are like, make beauty out of the sad, right? They're like the world's going to hell, find beauty in it. Trust me, like our artists are so good at that stuff. You know, I just remembered there was a specific quote unquote poem I actually wanted to mention to you, and I'm hoping that we can get people to listen to, because I feel like it reflects themes of the dream speakers that would be more powerful to telling a contemporary dream speaker story than a lot of the like stuff that they have in the book that's like, oh, these people have never changed their ways and pretty much are living in the past forever.
Mm-hmm.
So there's two halves of a poem on the most recent Tribe Called Red album, which is called Halluci Nation. And the first half is called Before, and the second half is called Soon. Okay, his name is Joseph Boyden. And I feel that if you want to get a really powerful feel for what it would be like to play a dream speaker that's living right now and having the experience of being an indigenous person right now, that listening to on that album Before and Soon by Joseph Boyden will give you a powerful feel for some of those. The person who is speaking in this poem is basically a contemporary dream speaker talking about his experience of white violence, which you could also interpret as technocratic violence. You can interpret it as violence at the hands of the rest of the council, but that's what it would, I feel like this person's talking about what it would feel like to be a dream speaker right now.
Is there any analog to Hermetic thought that would be within indigenous practices, like a very structured, rigid, occult, highly formalized, ritualistic way of practicing things?
You know, honestly, now that you mentioned them, that would probably be the hardest one.
Okay.
I think I'd have an easier time talking about a Son of Ether indigenous person. And here's why. Because I actually think when you're talking about like the more rigid structure, like that it employs a lot of like different kinds of like math even, I 1,000,000% see lots of indigenous folk within the Technocratic Union. However, the Hermetics ties to the occult and also their ties to essentially cultural theft, which they're extremely guilty of, I think would make it really hard for an indigenous person to feel really comfortable in that particular tradition. It might be that like I might have the easiest time maybe trying to write a House Ex Miscellaneae indigenous Hermetic, and I could work that together, but that's probably the hardest one. I apologize that I misspoke earlier. I mean, I could imagine all of them, but I'm like, oh wow, that one actually, it's mostly comes down to the way that they view the occult as something that belongs to them and is for them to consume, and how that has impacted indigenous peoples historically. That kind of attitude, it makes it really hard.
I wonder if there's almost a case where a character would interface with the Hermetics to get back their own culture. In the case that, like, for instance, the Incan knot thing.
Are you talking about the rope language?
Yes. Kipu. I could almost see the case where you would have a character where the Hermetics had picked this up during the Age of Conquest, were trying to decipher it, and a character were interfacing with them in an attempt to get it back. That you could almost have a character that was in the Order of Hermes trying to liberate or remove things from Hermetic practice practically.
I could potentially see that. Again, I think that would also, you might even agree with me, that character would probably be Ex Miscellaneae.
Yeah.
To pull that concept off.
Or House Fortunae is the only other one I could think of, the idea of...
Well, maybe, but they're basically House Ex Miscellaneae.
Yeah.
They don't like that, but that's true. That's true. That's where they have been for most of recent history. And also the idea that it would be more likely to be an indigenous person who comes from a group that had a lot more, the whole archaeologist syndrome, where people just came in and like straight up stole pieces of things and took off. Whereas the other thing to take into consideration with that concept is that by and large, when the Hermetics did interact with Dreamspeaker magic or Indigenous magic, they were like, wow, what a bunch of trash, you silly children.
To the point where half the North American Dreamspeaker delegation left in the 1700s after Primus Cristavo of the Order of Hermes was like, not very nice, I'll put it politely, and we will has gone over in Horizon Stronghold of Hope and Dreamspeakers 2nd edition. So so we've gone through that. And do you have any thoughts on what that technocratic Dreamspeaker would look like? Or pardon me, the technocratic indigenous practice?
I actually think this is really easy, but because of the way the World of Darkness, and especially Mage and Werewolf, kind of like their collective metaphysics and paradigm are written, it makes it harder for the player to see. But if you just apply actual life to it, it's really easy. So the Dreamspeakers are kind of written as being anti-technology, except for the special group that is pro-technology. But that's really weird, and the rest of them don't like them, right? But that's a bunch of bullshit. So, like, indigenous folk have been scientists and developers of technology since long before white people showed up, and we were really fucking good at it. You know, people talk about, oh, zero came from, you know, the concept of zero in math came from, you know, this part of the world over in the East, but also independently of that, indigenous folk came up with it. Yeah, we were incredible astronomers. Our maps of the stars sometimes, in some cases, surpassed what was happening in other parts of the world at the same period of time. And also our ability to establish sustainable farming technology far surpass anything that's sometimes even happening today. You know, they're like using satellites in really cool ways now to be able to look at the Earth without the foliage on top of it and see the shape of it. And they can see that there were like giant farms built in the mouth of the Amazon to grow food. They can, you know, and also here's another thing too. When the first white settlers showed up, when the first colonizers showed up in the Americas, they were going through the forests on the East Coast, and they're like, wow, these forests were divinely created by God and handed to us because the trees are separate and to such a degree that you can drive a wagon through without a branch hitting you, and all of them bear fruit. Thanks God, but they're not taking into consideration that that's a fucking farm that indigenous people built. Yeah. And then on top of that, let's battle a really shitty historian narrative. Sorry that I'm cursing so much, but I'm passionate about this.
That is fine. We will put the explicit tag on this and all be right in the world. Go nuts.
There's the whole narrative that like, oh, well, the whole reason that Europeans won in the war against indigenous folk was because their technology was so much better, and indigenous people had bad war technology and they couldn't fight them and they lost because they're fighting with bows and arrows or whatever, right? Except
the bow is vastly more accurate and deadlier. Sorry to steal your thunder.
First of all, I don't think there's a recorded battle between the U.S. Army and any Apache nation where the U.S. Army won unless it was a massacre against children and elders. I think the Apaches always beat them, and the times they didn't was when they chose to surrender. Additionally, the whole reason that the revolver exists as a gun was because the Comanche were decimating the Texas Rangers in battle, because while the Texas Rangers were like getting off their horse, stuffing their rifles, laying down and aiming, the Comanche were zipping back and forth in zigzags on their horses while riding them sideways so the horse's body was between them and the rifle, shooting the bow both above and below the body of the horse 6 times per minute, while they couldn't get like one shot off and they were getting destroyed. And like originally when Smith and Wesson were trying to sell the revolver, everyone was like, why? It has a short range, you know, it doesn't have the power of the rifle, this is dumb. But the Texas Rangers were like, oh, please, thank God, we need something that fires faster. Indigenous technology has a long history of being innovative and inventive, and it's also still happening right now in really powerful ways. In fact, because one of the aspects of science exploration that we're doing right now is in how to deal with climate change, where we happen to be all of a sudden being like, oh, maybe we should be paying attention to what indigenous people have been saying about climate change for hundreds of years. It came up with the fires in Australia. All of a sudden people were like, oh, we should have been listening to them, and like maybe we'll bring them in and have them help us deal with this problem. But the Maori leaders were like, I mean, sure, but also we've been telling you this since you showed up. And the reason it's like this now is because you never wanted to listen to us and you never want to take our science seriously. So the difference isn't that Dreamspeakers shouldn't be that they're anti-science, anti-technology. It should be that they're anti-Western science, anti-Western technology, which, yes, the technocracy is full of, but also I think you and I can both agree that technocracy loves innovation and it loves results. And the truth is that indigenous science is extremely innovative and brings results.
Yeah, and it's there because it works. This isn't a case where we're when some people say, sure, Western science, and immediately they're like, blah, 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 homeopathy. We're talking about the cultures that invented snow goggles and the kayak and rubber and figured out how to keep 30 cultivars of corn in constant rotation. That way you could choose what was being planted based on what it looked like the next crop season would be. And some of the first groups to come up with syringes or the hammock or oral contraceptives.
Aztecs were doing brain surgery, man, and people were living... surviving it, like, come on.
Yeah.
Like,
and
the whole like indigenous folk didn't have technology is such colonizer bullshit. So do indigenous people belong to technocracy? Yeah, they do, and they're there. One of my most important points of technology I like to make is that we knew how to wash our butts.
Yeah.
I really wish when colonizers showed up that they knew how to do that.
Yeah, and that was one of those cases where literally you had stories where you would have groups that refused to trade with settlers because they smelled bad.
Because they stank.
Yeah, literally you would have ropes going across rivers, and like you'd put something in a basket, wheel it over, and then you'd wheel it back, and then you'd burn the basket.
Yep. Yep.
Thank you so much for your time. Is there anything else you'd like our listeners to walk away with before they start diving into trying to find ways to introduce Indigenous viewpoints, characters, and cultures into their games? Or anything else you'd like to say about the World of Darkness?
Oh, man. Nothing that's, for that last thing, nothing that's short.
Okay.
There's,
so we
can
have
I
you back
talk
on
about
later.
two things?
Oh,
I was
go nuts.
rereading the tradition book, and I made like a lot of notes, but there was two things that really stood out to me as I'm like, oh, these are things we should talk about. One of them is that the history of Mage actually turns the history of colonization a bit on its head in a really awkward way. And it's something that I'm constantly thinking about because it really changes how you deal with colonization and the process of decolonization. It's that, technically speaking, before Contact, Sleeper Society did, Star of Eagles and Niobe and et al. Showed up to talk with the European mages before that happened. So in World of Darkness history, first contact happened amongst mages. And that really shifts a lot of, and also the other part of that story is Star of Eagles and all of them came to Europe, or technically to a horizon, right?
Yeah.
But that was a reflection.
They went to Mistridge, yeah.
Yeah, but it was a reflection of European paradigm. And so you have stories about like Kelikokio's canoe journey. So it's still people sailing to get to this place. I don't have like a, what do we do with this knowledge, but more of a like, it's really interesting because it really changes a lot of how Dreamspeakers are going to be dealing with the history of colonization and decolonization, considering that their history lines up that the way that they actually went to go meet the Europeans first. It's totally different from real world history, so it's hard to figure out what does this mean.
And you have Walking Hawk returning to North America 20 years before the Columbian Exchange begins. And
I actually have a big problem with that part of the story, and the reason is because the story goes that he returns from the big disastrous trip and helps foresees the future of the white people showing up and completely changing the world for the rest of time. And he warns the tribes to end up becoming the Iroquois Confederacy, and that's why they developed the Iroquois Confederacy. And I'm like, you should not be giving that to that reason, because you're taking away something that was a powerful invention of people, of indigenous people, that they did it without magical intervention. And I really don't like that part of the story. But yeah, you're right. That's also another part of it. Like that he came and warned them, and that's what built that powerful social community, that powerful state, I would even say, before kind of indigenous people engaging in the concept of state. They were a powerful state. So again, I don't really have like a good, like, here's what we do with this. It's more like, this is really strange, and it's a really strange thing for Dreamspeakers to have to contend with, because it's so different from what the actual lived experience of indigenous folk is and can ever be.
If we remove that one fact and we say that Walking Hawk was not the cause of that, it doesn't break anything else. Yeah, you're taking it away from something else, which happens in a lot of other game lines, and Mage is usually pretty good about, but this is a notable exception to that.
With that specific thing, I agree that you can take it out. But the bigger thing I'm looking at is the fact that indigenous folk contacted Europeans first, even though they're indigenous mages contacting European mages. That is so hard for me to wrap my head around, because it's not real history in any way whatsoever. So it's something to look at and think about and figure out, if you have a Dreamseeker whose particular connection to that history going all that far back, that it would have a big impact on the way they dealt with how colonization happened. The other thing that I feel like has to be addressed, it makes me mad, is that Odu, the 10th sphere, the sacred word, what they say, is the quote, "The first users of magic were the first namers. They called a thing into being by name, and there it was. The first dream speakers spoke sacred words and made their visions real." No, naming things is Western thinking. Naming things to quote unquote make them real or to give them power is a Western thing. You don't need to name things. They are powerful without you. That is such a basic idea. Again, when I'm going back to animism, you don't get to, you knowing the name or giving the name to the rock or the mountain is nothing. That mountain doesn't care about that name that you utter, that it's probably never even going to listen to. It has its power without that name. And the concept, this whole idea that their special 10th sphere is revolved around this super non-indigenous way of thinking, I cannot stand it. And I know plenty of us can be like, we can't stand the 10th sphere ideas, period. But also just that it was written in this book and it's so opposite to like Dreamspeaker paradigm. I'm like, this is so bad. I hate this. I hate the specific 10th sphere more than like other tradition 10th spheres.
That makes sense. Is that something that's carried forward into Revised?
Honestly, I don't recall it, and maybe we can do a Revised thing and explore that at some point.
That makes sense. Those are two big misses. And it's odd because even earlier in the Dreamspeaker book, they specifically talk about how one of the weapons wielded against them historically was the act of naming. So it was jarring reading that to be like, wait, what? And that was a paragraph I reread to mean like, did you mean something else? Is this a case where maybe the term word shouldn't be used? But thank you for pointing that out.
Even if they did mean something else, I don't think they communicated whatever it was. What they communicated was that the first users of magic were the first namers. Namers is actually, I wouldn't say it's very common, but I have absolutely heard it as like a derisive word for colonizers. So the givers of names, the namers. It's a reference to specifically like anthropologists and scientists that were like, everything has to have a name in order for us to define it. And like indigenous thinking doesn't really buy into that.
Again, thank you so much for your time and for your writing.
Yes.
Do you have anything that you're working on now or anywhere our listeners can engage with other projects that you're working on?
You can check out my Patreon where I do some monthly write. I try to write a couple things every month. It's JF Sambrano is what I use. By and large, most of my writing stuff that I'm working on is pretty long term right now. Like I have a novel I'm working on that I'm currently editing, and I have like a slew of short stories that I'm sending out and trying to get published. I'm not doing any game work specifically right now, role-playing work. However, but I am going to send a letter to Hunters Entertainment about maybe potentially seeing if I can help them with Pure Tribe stuff on Werewolf 5th. But that's a very big maybe, and a very big, even if it was a thing, like way in the future, right? So mostly my Patreon is where I'm doing stuff right now.
Also, not to tip our hat on the next time we're probably going to talk to James, the Mage 20th Guide to the Hollow Ones, though.
Yeah, well, we're talking about that. Yeah, we're talking about that.
Yeah, for listeners, James brings a panoply of writing expertise to Mage the Ascension, and we may be in tentative talks to try and get some Storyteller Vault content out there based on informed by things that James has done, and one of them will be the Hollowers, or the Hollow Ones.
Yeah, I've written a lot of them.
Gothdigenous.
That's me.
Yeah. So that was super weird because you were in the Discord and some guy's like, I like the Hollow Ones. You were like, fucking goths. And I'm like, wait, what? Which way does this go? Was that a loving?
It was very loving.
Or not? And I'm like, it took me a while. And you're like, no, I love the Hollow Ones and the Youth Editors. I'm like, wow.
I love the Hollow Ones, and also the Hollow Ones deserve being made fun of a lot of the time.
It's a yes and. I fully understand that. Every actuary joke is true. That doesn't mean you should make them. We'll have all this stuff in our show notes. If you have any thoughts on this interview or other ideas that you would like to share on maybe other paradigms or deep dives into beliefs, and by deep dives I mean remarkably shallow dives, because these are things that large groups of people have literally accumulated across millennia, but it's still more than we get in most of the game books. Shoot us an email, magethepodcast@gmail.com, @magethepodcast on Twitter. If you'd like to support our operations, go to magethepodcast.com, click on support the show, and you can become an executive producer and help make these episodes possible. Join us in our Discord, discord.me/magethepodcast. Tell us your thoughts. All of James' writing and information on what James is up to will be in our show notes. See us there. And with that, bye.